Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And welcome to this presentation, Classroom Assessment by Irpan Apandi Batubara. And this presentation is to complete my assignment in language testing and evaluation with Professor Fuad Abdul Hamid. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's start the presentation today. Uh, Talking about classroom assessment, actually this is a chapter reading report from fall her 2010, and the overview of my presentation is the first is introduction, and then proceed to assessment for learning, and then self and peer assessment, proceed to dynamic assessment, and then assessment and second language acquisition, and also there will be explanation about criterion reference test in classroom assessment, and some more views about the dynamic assessment later. So, ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about classroom assessment, actually we have to consider also why uh, actually large-scale standard assessment is not enough. As we know that the large-scale standard assessment is mostly a high-stake test, and it's very dilemmatic to the students. For example, when a large-scale standard is done, then some students will get a good score, and then other will get a very low score, and in fact it becomes a demotivation for the student, and sometimes the failure makes them feel frustrated. So classroom assessment here is to advocate the thing that happened, because sometimes it seems not uh, not fair enough for all students. So there is an issue of injustice in the large-scale standard, and CA is to advocate this, because later in CA or classroom assessment, the teacher will also play as a mediator to help the student achieve the goals of their learning. So, in general, actually, the assessment for learning and the dynamic assessment have much in common, and they have a different theoretical basis. One is highly pragmatic approach to classroom assessment, and while the other is driven by socio-cultural theory. So it brings us to the chapter focus. So actually this chapter focus on classroom assessment for learning, and then also about the dynamic assessment. That's it. So now we proceed to the first focus, which is the assessment for learning. Ladies and gentlemen, the assessment for learning is very interesting to discuss. So let's see how the traditional paradigm believes and how latest paradigm believes. So the traditional mostly are sequential, because usually in the class there will be goals, and then there will be activity, uh, and at the end of the class there will be evaluation. And according to Black and William, in traditional paradigm of assessment, there will be usually formative assessment, and the result of the test assumes students' achievement. So one of the keyword in traditional assessment is the achievement and the score. While in latest paradigm, so in this case is the dynamic assessment. Actually, assessment is used in the process of learning in order to improve learning. So here later we will see how important feedback for students is, and how this kind of assessment diagnose students' individual learning. And actually, there's a belief that information through assessment is potential to modify or change teaching activities for to better meet and needs for learner. Traditional beliefs that, for example, when one student get his score, if it is good, then he will be more motivated. If he failed, there should be another situation. While in the dynamic assessment, it's different. So we see how student at the first or at the beginning of the course and how they are after completing the course. I quote from the book, in many situations there is an expectation from learners, parents, and the school management that teacher will grade each piece of work. So every assignment should be graded, right? Should get score. But then, is it good? In fact, research says not always. So this is how it is elaborated. So research about assessment for learning has found a number of key points, so such as participation, feedback, and then descriptive rather than evaluative. Also, the research see how students' metacognitive awareness of their own learning process happens in the classroom is very important. So, generally, research discovered that a number of simple practice uh, led to significant level of improvement. So, when the student participate more in the class based on research, they get more in the class. And when the feedback is given clearly, and it can become a like it has an effect to the learning of the students, and also uh, there's a significant positive improvement when the feedback is given descriptive, like for example in one question, you don't get this question, you have to be like this, and there is a feedback, and it is better affect the student than just give the evaluative. For example, you get 60 means you fail, for example, and students' cognitive awareness of their own learning also give a good impact to the learning. We now come to self and peer assessment. Why we are talking about self and peer assessment? Because actually in dynamic assessment, uh, the student as an individual and the process of how they as an individual learn from what they do in the classroom becomes very prominent here. So actually self and peer assessment is to develop a clear picture of the goal of their own learning and compared to their current performance. So how they are at the beginning of the course and how they are currently after the course in the case of their performance. And students rate their own work and the work of their colleagues. So as a self-assessment, they have a share to define their work. So uh, actually here the roles of teacher is very important to promote the transparency to the criteria for success and the fairness. And the practice of self and peer assessment using transparent criteria is designed primarily to assist the development of awareness of the gap between what is being produced now and the target performance, thus improving learning. And the challenge actually is research has shown that without substantial experience of applying the criteria of work samples, self-assessment can fluctuate substantially. So uh, the self-assessment sometimes is not measurable, and it is different from the large scale. For example, like we can see that most of the students, for example, are good enough in this course, but here in self-assessment, every individual has different kind of assessment, for example. So if you see the presentation, there is an example of a continuous assessment card, how they how they are, for example, in the first meeting and the second meeting. There is an example of the model of a continuous assessment card that is proposed by Oscarson. Now we come to the dynamic assessment. After we talk about self-assessment, actually the dynamic assessment is in the same corridor. I remember when I took the learning assessment class, when we talk about self-assessment means we also talk about dynamic assessment with Professor Puat told to us. So in dynamic assessment, the learning connect current ability to goal that learner wishes to achieve. And it support the zone of proximal development, that is theory, the theory of Vygotsky, where Vygotsky believed that current stage and the next stage of development should be considered in learning. And the role of teacher as a mediator is very important according to Lantop and Pohner, and they are still in the same corridor with Vygotsky. Ladies and gentlemen, in dynamic assessment, assessment and instruction are a single activity that seeks to simultaneously diagnose and promote learner development by offering learners mediation, a qualitative difference form of support from feedback. So mediation is provided during the assessment procedure and is intended to bring to light underlying problems and help learners to overcome them. So mediation here is about intervening in the learning process in a way that aids learner to modify their use of language communication so they can constantly improve. So this is the role of teacher here. Ladies and gentlemen, in dynamic assessment, Lantop and Pohner proposed the three methods. The first one is the graduate from, the second one is the testing the limit, and the third is mediate learning experience. What happened in graduate from? Actually here the mediator creates a test with a graded series of questions to ask a learner who has problems completing a test. And after that, the second one is testing the limits. In this case, learners are given feedback on their performance on a test and then asked to verbalize the problems they feel they have faced and what they will try to do to overcome them. And the third one, mediated learning experience, it's a one-to-one interaction in which the mediator, in here the teacher, interactively helps the learner move toward the next stage of learning through scaffolding attempts to communicate. Interesting, right? So, by the way, actually, each technique in this case challenge the data. Okay, so most of dynamic assessment has to occur with individuals, which is problematic. Despite the reference to group of dynamic assessment, actually the sandwich approach. So the sandwich approach here, which compares whether the graduate from or the testing limits or the immediate learning comes, it is flexible. So many teachers around the world are faced with large classes, many students in the classroom. Well, this kind of mediation is not possible sometimes. So the dynamic assessment is believed will be well implemented more and more in the class with a smaller number of students. Okay, if we have to understand how actually the dynamic assessment and the standardized assessment sees what is the change happen to students after the learning, the point is like this. So dynamic assessment believes that feedback is to cause change in learner, and this kind of assessment to predict learner development from their current stage to the next. And in standardized tests, learner state remains stable for a period of time, and actually the test is not intended to cause a change. So this is not, of course, to say that classroom assessments should adhere to the same validity criteria as the standardized test. We have seen that it is a very different paradigm with different rules. Nevertheless, even this weak notion of validity as successful change is not without its problems, as we cannot sure that the intervention is the cause of learning, for example. So this is because the definition, there can be no comparison with what any other learner is doing. Okay. And now we see the assessment for second language acquisition. So the dimension of second language acquisition usually represent in the development of variation, but then this is debated also. So in the terms of development and variation. So in the development, usually the assessment for second language acquisition is regular and then predictable, just like large-scale standardized tests. And actually in variation, which is the belief of dynamic assessment, the result of individual is different. So teacher knowledge about students' language development implies the link between assessment and second language acquisition. Well, the closest that second language acquisition research can offer is Krashen. So Krashen believes in natural order hypothesis, where naturally the language acquisition happens from one simple to one that is more complex. But then the problem is that the regular and predictable development has only been described for the very limited area of morpheme acquisition and English. In fact, the dynamic assessment comes with a more comprehensive approach. So there is a discussion about criterion reference testing here, but I'm not talking too much about this. I just see some problem here that actually achievement measurement can be defined as the assessment of terminal or criterion behavior. So this involves the determination of the characteristic of students' performance with respect to specified standard. And in criterion reference testing here actually is to respond the critics on classroom assessment, because as I have taught before, that classroom assessment seems not measurable. So one of the key features of classroom testing is that the test takers are not compared with each other. But then Stiggins believes that puts it the change is from merely sorting students to ensuring attainment of specific competencies. If there is a score at all, it means that it is not derived from the distribution of scores, but from the assessment in this case. And talking about the dependability, actually, Professor Puat have explained to us very clearly about this. But let me remind you that in the situation that actually in classroom testing, we wish to know whether the result of the assessment are dependable. So then we concern whether an estimate of a learner current stage would change if the test is conducted, the assessment that is administered by different teacher. For example, I uh, I distribute the test in one class, and what if it is tested by other teacher? There is a formulation or a like a statistical way to find the agreement of or coefficient, for example, and also the p lambda is introduced, and you can see in my PowerPoint slides. And finally, actually some thoughts on the theory is still very dynamic, so there is debate. One expert agree with another, but I will emphasize one here that actually dynamic assessment is different. Why? Because it is based upon sociocultural theory. Indeed, the jargon of dynamic assessment is frequently impenetrable on first encounter with the literature. When it comes to looking at the example of DA practice, they seem to differ little from what most language teacher would do anyway. So this raises the question of why the associated theory is necessary to explain the evidence. Simply speaking, actually, the dynamic assessment is not quite similar to most teacher, but if they want to care more about their class, they will start and do that better and better. I think that's all my presentation about classroom assessments. Thank you very much. And if you have a question, you may contact me via WhatsApp or you can comment below. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And thank you, Professor Puat.